Hey guys, and welcome back to Pixel Cherry Ninja's channel. So we have a special guest for you, someone that's highly regarded and very much liked in the Mr. FPGA community. We have Porkchop from the website MiSTerAddOns. They're also the sponsor of my weekly Saturday show, only that particular segment. So this has nothing to do with the sponsorship. This is someone I wanted to interview just because of all the work and all the products that they've brought to, let's say, the Mr. Universe. So let me introduce you guys to Porkchop Express from MiSTerAddOns. The floor is yours if you want to introduce yourself.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me on this podcast interview. Appreciate been working with you now just for a few weeks, maybe a few months. But yeah, I'm Porkchop. I run MiSTerAddons.com. I make Mister accessories. Started in 2018, and I've made several things since then, including a new peripheral line called Reflex. So glad to be here.
Okay, awesome. We'll talk a bit about Reflex a little bit later in there because I am definitely a fan of that. But we'll start with one of the first questions we got from FPGA Gaming. So they're a big fan of your store and they've used it multiple times. What they want to learn about is your background in engineering and inspirations for some of the products. Like, what got you into this? So, you heard about Mister, you started using it, and then what was the process of going, okay, let me make some products, and then you turned it into a business, and obviously with your engineering background, in context as well.
Yeah, so I like I said, I started with Mister in 2018. I had been looking on some forum, I can't remember which, and following Kevtris's Zimba 3000 all-in-one FPGA idea he had been kicking around and kind of asking what's the right price point? Would people be interested in this? And at that point, Kevtris, wasn't yet working for Analog or with Analog, but had still, garnered a lot of respect in the community for his FPGA work. So around that time, I, happened upon Smoke Monster's videos, his Mister series, and started getting interested and bought a DE10 Nano. And at that time, all of the vendors were selling on forum posts in the old Atari forums. And so I noticed everyone was out of stock. So I was like, okay, I'll just order a few boards for myself. And anyone that's ordered PCBs before knows that you have to order in like groups of 5 or 10. And so I thought, cool, I'll order 10. I'll solder the ones for myself. I'll hop on the forums and sell the extras. So the night I got my stuff, sat down, soldered everything up, tested it, listed it on the forums, and sold everything pretty immediately and thought, okay, this is interesting. So that's kind of my start of Mister, and kind of the rest is history, just grown since then. In terms of my engineering background, I remember sitting down at the computer in high school after I'd been accepted to college and looking at a drop down list of options for majors to declare. And I was like, oh man, I don't know. I haven't thought about this at all. But I thought, well, I don't mind math. I like computers and electronics. And my dad was like, well, choose engineering over programming. Because at that time, there was a whole fear about outsourcing and oversee working for programming. So chose electrical engineering and just kind of like barreled my way through it and liked it well enough. But the Mister side of things started out as me just enjoying soldering, which is a technician level skill. It's not a professional engineer skill or ability. In fact, they teach you it once in electrical engineering and pretty much never again. But I really enjoy soldering. And so that's kind of how I got it into Mister. And through that learned board design, board layout, and some other stuff. But I try not to oversell my abilities. I know some people think I take too much credit. I don't try to take too much credit for anything really, but that's kind of my background with Mister and with electrical engineering.
Okay, no, I definitely don't think you oversell yourself because, so guys, just a little bit of background. So before I spoke to Porkchop regarding getting a sponsor for my weekly show, I covered his stuff on the channel. Like just because I thought it was interesting within the FPGA space, and I had some dealings with him before, like earlier on, and whether it was over Twitter or anywhere else, and it was always positive. The guy was always polite, so you're a nice guy, man. Um, Okay, without making it sound too moppy. So we've got something here from Adventure Taco. You've kind of answered that question, but he says he wears his Mr. Add-ons hat with pride to tourneys, and I kind of you kind of answered his question, which is what was the first thing you worked on the Mr. platform, which would have been the boards. What did you work on after that? So if we kind of change that question up a bit, so you've done the boards. What was the kind of next step? Did you get a big inventory in, and what was the first thing you were selling? Was it just the soldered boards, or was there additional items you started bringing in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had to think about this one for a second. Because, yeah, obviously I was just soldering the official boards, SD RAM, the USB hub, and the IO board at the time. But something that was interesting about the USB hub originally, it didn't have any connector to be able to connect it to the DE10 Nano. So you'd cut and solder a micro USB cable to the USB hub and then wrap it around and plug it into the DE10 Nano's micro USB port. And a friend of mine, uh, Arithmaldor, had this project he was working on to try to make some kind of USB connection, micro USB connection from the USB hub that was cleaner. And so that was the first thing I worked on with this really strange, very thin PCB that stretched between the little standoffs and connected the USB hub to the D10 Nano. And looking back, it was a total monstrosity. But at the time, I had not learned any kind of electronic design, PCB layout. I walked by people in college that were doing it. But in college, you kind of have to pick and choose. There's way too much to learn in a degree. And so I never did any PCB layout. So I learned KeyCAD to make this funny looking USB bridge thing for the USB hub. That was the first minor project. The first major project or major product, I guess, that I released has to have been MiSTerCade, which was in 2021. That was like the first large scale, totally standalone product that I designed for Mister, and
Right.
one that I'm very proud of.
Yeah, no, it's got yeah, there's a lot of people that like it. Now, so the Mr. Cade, is that so is there two versions of it? Is there two versions of it? So educate me and educate any of the viewers that don't know. I'm sure many people do. So is there one that just goes in one arcade, and is there a separate one that goes in two arcades, or is it like a one-stop solution? You can put it in one or you can put it in two by attaching something to it. Because let's face it, when we went arcade versus city arcades were all, the back-to-back ones, where if they were laid side to side, they were the most comfortable because there was no, touching elbows or doing everything. You were focused, and a lot of times if they were opposite each other, back to back, you didn't know who you were playing. So your MiSTerCade, is it for single arcades, or is it for single and double, or are they like separate products or one product?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, MiSTerCade itself is a basically a JAMA complete kit that goes around the DE10 Nano. So you need a DE10 Nano, a stick of SD RAM, and the MiSTerCade itself. And that exposes a JAMA edge, a PCB edge. And JAMA is an arcade standard from, I think, the late 80s that pretty much most of the arcades, at least I grew up with, use. And so it's a standard connector that has ground, 12 volts, positive 5 volts, negative 5 volts, video, audio, and then all the controls on one edge. And it's a standard pinout. So basically, MiSTerCade is a way for you to take your DE10 Nano, build this kit around it, and then plug it into virtually any arcade cabinet built after the 80s. And it plugs into one arcade cabinet using the JAMA harness, just like a regular arcade board. It has amplified video levels that are now adjustable. It has amplified audio, uh, pretty loud, I think 13-watt amplifier, mono amplifier, all that stuff. And that's been something I've been very proud of. And that's for one cabinet. Now, you were mentioning some of the cabinets have an internal link. So you have kind of like two different control panels, two different CRTs. And like you said, you're not doing the arcade one up thing where you're like totally smashed against the other player. And I just recently made a separate product for MiSTerCade called MiSTerCade Versus, which is a way to daisy chain cabinets. So you have your main cabinet with MiSTerCade, and then you run two cables over to the next cabinet, plug in this board, and suddenly the audio and video are synced up and the controls are sent back to the main MiSTerCade. And you can do that for as many arcade machines as you have theoretically. I've tested with four, but because each stage amplifies audio and video and has a USB hub, kind of each link is its own single link on the chain. So it's not like the signal totally falls apart as you extend it. So that's MiSTerCade versus.
Awesome. Okay, and while on the subject of Mr. Cade, Concade Gaming have asked, what's the status updates on Mr. Cade V2 dual RAM, please? And I think you've been tweeting about that. I can't remember if it's ready to order now or if it's coming soon. So do you want to update us on the digital version, Mr. Cade, the dual RAM version?
Yeah, so let's take a step back just for a second and talk about dual SD-RAM and its kind of history with MiSTer and its use case and kind of the pros and cons. It's not a total slam dunk. When you put in a second SD-RAM module, you're using the second bank of pin headers or second pin header on the DE10 Nano, and that means analog video is out of the question until you use basically direct video to bring it back into the picture. So you're basically plugging your second SD-RAM into the left set of pins, then you're having to get your HDMI signal converted to RGB using a DAC, and then you have analog video back, but you don't have HDMI video output, which in the sense of arcades is not really a huge loss unless you're someone who likes to capture and play, in the easiest way possible. That's one of the things I love most about MiSTer is you have beautiful, clean HDMI signal for the vast majority of gamers, but you also have pretty great, and we'll talk about this later, but even improving analog video signal at the same time. So what you trade off with a dual SD RAM is the ability to output HDMI video and analog video. Not really a huge deal for most people, but I just wanted to get that kind of like on the table before we talk about it. So I am working on a version 2 of MiSTerCade. I just sent the third prototype, which I think has everything fixed out for assembly, and so hopefully in about 2 weeks I'll have something concrete to show. In the meantime, I ordered a single SD-RAM version, and kind of the reason I'm not trying to jump the gun with dual SD-RAM is that there aren't any use cases yet. People get upset when I say yet. The future is totally wide open. I mean, MiSTer 3 years ago looks incredibly different than it does right now. But so far, you had the PSX core that started out with single and dual and ended up as single. You have a Jaguar core, which is nowhere near working well, that uses dual SD-RAM. And then you have a few unreleased cores, and the Saturn core, which has builds for both and is pretty far from being done on either. So it's kind of like uncertain landscape. But yes, I will be working and I will be selling easily first quarter of 2024 a dual SD-RAM MiSTerCade, with the caveat that yes, you're giving up HDMI output, which isn't a big deal. You have two RGB outputs on MiSTerCade. One is an amplified one for your cabinet, and the other one is a consumer level 700 millivolt. So you can put that into a capture directly or upscale it and then capture that as well.
Okay, no, that's interesting. Different strokes for different folks, as they say. So, I mean, I'm happy. I'm happy with the analog one and the digital one. I got, in fact, yesterday I posted a tweet. I actually took it around to a friend's house, and it was really funny because his TV that he had, there was so much input latency and it had no game on. It felt like 5-6 frames of lag. It was terrible. So in the end, we ended up playing on like a Dell monitor without sound. But yeah, I mean, the analog, the digital one definitely have their advantages. But in a modern world, when I'm taking it out, I'm really happy with the digital one. It's not, analog's not something that I commonly use, but I understand obviously different people have different needs. If you're fortunate to have lots of arcade machines, then yeah, you wanna plug that straight into our CRT. That makes a lot of sense. Right, what do we have next? Okay, so now we've got you previously teased like a Mr. Express, was it? So like a consoleized Mr. Or is that a case or like an all-in-one unit that you're setting, a consoleized Mr. Express? Is that something that's been canned, or is that put on a back shelf? Or is that something that's ever going to see the light of day?
Yeah, no, it definitely is still in development, but the updates have been sporadic. With when I started my business, it was easy to make a product because there wasn't a whole stable of other products that you're trying to support. You're trying to order more of. Orders have increased over time. The number of projects have increased over time too. But Express is kind of like it's my biggest one, and I'm not rushing it, and that's kind of for one or two reasons. First of all, the production cost to make an enclosure is in the tens of thousands of dollars. So I don't want to rush the design only to find out, oh, I really didn't think about this one thing, and now I have to redo the molding. It's going to be injection molded or aluminum, cast aluminum, so it's going to be a premium solution. But no, yeah, it's still in the works. But the vision as MiSTer has changed over the years since I've started, and as my vision has changed, I'm just not rushing it. So there are other solutions out there for people who want that form factor. I believe mine's going to be better. I mean, if it wasn't, I wouldn't bother doing it. I'm not. There are already good things out there, but I'm trying to make something better. And then I also have my passively cooled aluminum case that's been a huge hit over the last coming up on 3, maybe 4 years. And so, yeah, Express is still in the pipeline. Um, I will update as soon as I have something concrete, but without saying too much now, some things have changed that I've wanted to capture in the design before I make it totally final.
Okay, no, that's a fair question. I'm a fan of your aluminium cases. I like it. Apparently, I read in places it overheats. Now, I was once doing a video and I think I ran it for maybe like 4 hours straight, running like the Sega Saturn core, but I didn't find it uncomfortably hot or anything. So I'm not quite sure what people are kind of saying there, because I thought, okay, it might get a little bit hot, it might get a little bit uncomfortable. But when I held it, like I'm used to holding, so I'm a fan of like handheld PCs. Before the Steam Deck, I had a lot of Chinese devices. I still use one. Some of the earlier ones, they actually get quite hot where they get a bit uncomfortable when you're holding them. Obviously, I'm not holding the MiSTer when I'm playing it, but I didn't find it get too hot. Like, what's the deal with that? Are the temperatures acceptable, or was there ever a case of any of them like getting too hot, like maybe some early versions or something?
Yeah, I've seen that just a few times. I mean, the example I always use is I have a customer who lives in Kuwait and he runs his in the desert 24/7 in aluminum case. Granted, I'm sure he has some amount of air conditioning, but um, no, the FPGA used on the MiSTer, the D10, on the DE10 Nano is, I mean, FPGAs generally speaking are not consumer devices. They're made for development. In my previous job, you'd see FPGAs everywhere in avionics. They're used a lot for their real-time computing, basically zero latency applications with aircraft, and so they're industrial devices. And the one used on MiSTer has a maximum temperature rating of 100 degrees C. Um, there, I can't say people haven't experienced something, but with the number of cases I've sold, developers that use them, um, leave them on 24/7 all year round with no issue. I don't quite see where that's coming from. There are people who have pushed the HDMI transmitter chip. Um, MiSTer has some modes, some video resolutions that actually exceed the pixel clock rating of the HDMI transmitter. Possibly that, but really hard to say. I haven't seen enough reports for me to think that it really happens. And in the case of, like you were mentioning, the handheld gamings, when a traditional CPU overheats, a lot of them will kind of undervolt and underclock themselves to recover their thermal range. But an FPGA doesn't really work that way, and I seriously doubt anything's pushing it to get anywhere near its max temp limit. But it doesn't have a internal temperature sensor, so there's really no way other than measuring the outside of the device, outside of the chip, the heat spreader, to know what the temperature is. But the temperature on the heat spreader is like, I want to say like 50 or 60 degrees C. So I really just can't imagine the case has any bearing or any overheating problems based on the quantity sold and based on just understanding of how the things work.
Okay, no, that's a fair answer. Okay, a little bit of a funny question here from someone called Afflicted One. So I'm just gonna kind of read it out. So I don't know anything about this because since I've been covering MiSTer, I've kind of always seen you around. So he says, ask why he seems to go AWOL randomly for various stretches of time. I've read on multiple Reddit posts on FPGA subs. I've also read that he's a cool dude and has a great service. The conflicting info makes me nervous to do business with him. So I guess this is someone that's concerned. They're reading stuff that says you disappear for a bit, and then they're reading different things saying, you know, you're a really good guy and you're really good, you know, you're really good as far as your customer service and dealing with you for a purchase goes. So I know nothing about this AWOL. If you've got anything to say on that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I haven't had any lapses of being online or present or reachable since I've started in 2018, including unfortunately when I've taken vacations, I've still, checked my emails and done correspondence. I'm active and always have been on Discord. I've been active on Twitter. Unfortunately, too much, and sometimes, most days I tweet something. Um, Maybe they're thinking like I used to post a tiny bit on Reddit and a tiny bit on the Resetera forum, and I didn't really enjoy. I don't really like Reddit for lots of reasons, but maybe they're saying I'm not active on Reddit or Resetera. That's possible. I'm also on Arcade Projects forum. There's a MiSTerCade post there that I check in on periodically, but as a one person team with a day job to keep track of as well. Twitter and Discord are my two. And then, of course, my website, both the chat and the email, I'm very responsive to. So I'm not quite sure. I guess maybe if you can contact that person to find out more information, that'd be interesting. But no, I've never gone dark for more than, maybe a day or two.
Oh, okay, no, no, that's fair enough. Maybe they go on Reddit a lot, and like you said, your presence isn't there because, like I'm not a big channel or anything, but sometimes I just have to switch off for a bit and come back. And the thing is, when you switch off and come back, it's like everything's mounted up, and you kind of want to go through everything there to see is there anything useful there. You don't want to neglect people. So, and I guess the honest answer is you can't be on every bit of social media 24/7. It's just not humanly possible. So you do have to kind of miss some. I will answer this person in the comments. I think it was on, no, it was on Twitter that they asked. So I'll go on Twitter and respond to that a little while after this. Okay, so let's have a look at something decent here now. Okay, we've got something here from video game esoterica, who says, why do you prefer Big Trouble in Little China over Escape from New York? Now, before you answer that, I just have to say I like Escape from New York, but I watched Big Trouble in Little China when I was a kid. I absolutely loved it. Kim Cattrall was young and hot in there, and there was a guy that ate a fish like a Mars bar. So I'm with you on this Big Trouble in Little China, but what? Right. So why do you prefer it over that? You don't need to explain it to me. This is for Video Game Esoterica. I know he's weird, but he's a friend.
Oh yeah, he's great. We've had our ups and downs over the years, but I really appreciate him. Um, yeah, it's a great question, but I think like so many things, it's rooted in nostalgia. I saw Big Trouble in Little China when I was probably 5 years old on cable. I don't know if my parents knew what it was, but we watched it anyways, and it blew my mind and left this like huge impression on me. I mean, it's comedy, it's action, it's campy, it's 80s, it has practical effects, it has ninjas, it has a truck driver, it has magic. I mean, it's just everything. It's like it feels like the 80s. There are so many iconic 80s movies, be it the Goonies, any of those, but like for me, Big Trouble in Little China is just my favorite. It's untoppable, and of course, Kurt Russell can make no bad movies. So his other movies are great as well. There's no shade being thrown at those. It's just nostalgia and really the whole package for me.
Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense, man. In fact, what I actually did, so I've been playing games on the Mist. I was going to use some Fightcade replays to make the footage look good. I might still put some in there, but I actually found a hack of Bad Dudes versus Dragon Ninja, but it's done with the graphics and everything of Big Trouble in Little China. So that will be, it might even be on now. That will be used as an overlay for this video. So good answer. Uh,
Excellent.
Video Game Esoterica. Big Trouble in Little China, yeah, is definitely the superior movie, and that comes from Porkchop and myself.
Yep, that's my official stance, as subjective as it can be.
Excellent. Okay, so we had a few questions, in particular about Mars, but then let's kind of broaden that now. So what we're going to say is, where do you see FPGA gaming in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years? You previously just said, the Mister changed a lot. the Mr. project changed a lot from when you first got into it. So so next year, if everything kind of goes to plan, it seems like we're going to be getting Mars FPGA. We're going to be getting the Analog 3D, which doesn't have Open FPGA, but honestly, I'm very, very confident it's going to have access to other cores. If not for any other reason, just because there's more options now in the market. And then recently announced the Replay 2. So potentially there's three other FPGA consoles coming. Do you see yourself, I don't know, stocking these, making accessories for it, making innovative products like you've created for the Mister, creating solutions for either one or all of them? Like, where do you see yourself when the market expands and new consoles come, onto the field?
That is an excellent question. The future is obviously as full of surprises and very uncertain as it always has been. I think for me, the cores, a little bit about my gaming history. I was pretty much a 90s gamer. NES was the first console I got, and I was years late to that. My parents kind of had a passive approach to video games, but they were never a huge fan. So, I mostly played games at my friend's house. I had one or two consoles myself. But N64, Dreamcast, uh, those are kind of the last consoles, and PlayStation 1. Those are the last consoles I had. And after that, I got busy with young adult to adult life and kind of, I dabbled a bit, I kind of switched to first person shooters, Halo. This is a bit of a tangent, but to say the N64 core on the Mister is pretty much like that, and Virtual Boy are the last two cores I personally really feel like completes the ecosystem for me. Having said that, a Dreamcast core, that sounds incredible. I played a ton of Dreamcast and I love arcade cores as well. The only issue with arcade cores is they're usually huge development efforts and they can play relatively few games. So bang for your development time, the consoles are higher. I have a soft spot for arcade cores, and there are still plenty of those to be done. I think one theme I'm seeing pretty clearly in the gaming space right now is the push for 4K, whether it's an upscaler, which we all know pretty well right now. There's a lot of commotion with 4K upscaler stuff. Um, and Mars, of course, has announced 4K, as well as the other project, the Arcade Replay 2. And I think that's going to be something that most gamers who are sane and don't use CRTs like me, um, they're going to want 4K output. And then, of course, they just want, more cores. And the D10 Nano is kind of stretching its limits here, but at the same time, we have a almost 100% complete N64 core on the D10 Nano, and it just goes to show the skill of a developer can really push the hardware limits over time.
Okay, yeah, no, the N64 core, it's amazing. So for anyone that's unaware, which there might be like two of you in the world, it plays every retail game now. At least every retail game boots up, and it goes either into game or into the intro, but every game boots up, and it's been a journey. Like I've personally enjoyed the development of that because I was off and I was covering it in live streams, and I've kind of covered it, and it is amazing. But for me, yeah, what you say about the Mister there is actually excellent because even if newer FPGA solutions come and they cover stuff like the Dreamcast and like later arcade systems, there's plenty of arcade systems that aren't done yet and are perfectly doable on the Mister. So, as well as all these new projects, Mister still has plenty of life left in it.
Yep, and of course, I would never say I'm not going to work with anybody in the future. I don't currently have any plans to do anything outside of Mister, other than my Reflex line of accessories. With a family and a day job, I kind of have to pick and choose what things I really want to invest time and energy into. But I think the other projects coming up are very ambitious, and I mean, definitely if they accomplish most of what they set out to do, that's going to be a huge success, and it's going to be a huge win for open source gaming, open source preservation of this hardware that's becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Um, I think the thing I've been interested in seeing is Robert Pipes, the PlayStation, N64, Game Boy Advance, Wonder Swan Links, and the chess core developer. Um, he surprises himself with how fast he develops, but it still takes him, only one person, of course. It took him like the better part of a year to make a PlayStation 1 core. And as you advance through the console generations, the architecture and the complexity of the systems just goes up nearly exponentially. So I'm trying to see the vision of much beyond Dreamcast, much beyond N64, with software emulation being pretty complete for, let's say, the GameCube or the Wii. It's kind of interesting to see. I think arcade cores and then maybe some lesser known earlier cores, 3DO or CDI, might see some love, but it's kind of hard to predict, I guess.
Yeah, see, like that. So with GameCube, I'm extremely happy with Dolphin. Like I like the emulation on it. With Dreamcast, I meddle with emulation, and that's the kind of future core. The two cores I really want is obviously the Naomi one, Dreamcast and CPS3. But unfortunately, when it comes to Dreamcast emulation, like I want it primarily for the fighting games on there. Capcom versus SNK2 being the main one. There's just too much input latency. I've tried messing about with it, but there's just too much lag. It feels like you're playing underwater. So that's why that's my future want. Naomi, I guess above everything else at the moment. So it'd be nice to see, yeah, what comes.
Absolutely, yeah. Marvel versus Capcom 2 is my favorite fighting game of all time. I played a ton of it on Dreamcast, and I would love to see a Naomi or a Dreamcast core. I have multiple Dreamcast and multiple Naomi setups, and I have a candy cabinet dedicated to Naomi multi-boot. So I'm with you right there. That's totally a
Wow.
pipe dream. I just got a CPS3 board. I'm not pretending to be very good at fighting games. I enjoy them casually as one of my main arcade game things, but as I've kind of gotten older, I found that the game I enjoy most is like making things and designing things. That's like super satisfying to me. So playing games has become like a secondary benefit, the things I'm making. And so yeah, it's been interesting, but I think there's so much potential for research, development, documentation, and new cores to come out. It'd be foolish of me to say for sure this is what will be out in 2 years. So
Okay, no, fair answer. Okay, we're going to move on to this one. So, John Sundberg, now there's a way you asked a question. I asked a decent question, it ended it with something bad, and I kind of cut it out in my notes, but I remember what it was. So, the question they asked was, why do you make controller adapters with HDMI connectors? And then they went on to say, it's ridiculous. So, please explain why HDMI connectors? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages?
yeah, so it is a great question, and it's an odd. I admit, at first glance, it's very odd. I actually didn't come up with the standard for this or the way of doing this. Bliss, who makes kind of made the original idea of normalizing all of these funky shaped non-standard controller connectors. I guess the DE9 port used on like Master System, Atari, and Mega Drive, as well as the HD15 connector used in the Jaguar are standard ports, and the DB15 connector used in Neo Geo. Like there are some standard ports, but so many like Nintendo never used a standard port. So PlayStation definitely did their own thing, and I think for good reason. Like standard ports are great, but the ones that the actual console manufacturers came up with are better. So that's kind of step one. Is I started out using actually reselling for Bliss their adapters and decided to continue using them because the HDMI connector has 19 pins. And so what does 19 pins buy you? Well, it buys you 5 volts, 3.3 volts, ground, and then, 14 or 15 data pins that you can use, which pretty much is enough pins for every single controller, including Jaguar and Neo Geo, that need like 11 or 12 data pins. So why HDMI? Well, it's readily available. It has enough pins. And the goal of these adapters is to, instead of having, let's say I design a snack product, and the snack product has an NES port on it. Well, then if I want to design a Super Nintendo snack product, I need a Super Nintendo controller port. And all of this is doable. You can buy these parts, it's not a problem. But now you have to make enclosures for these things. Now you have one enclosure for each adapter. And so the cable is a nicer way to standardize your controller's connector to a standard pinout that you can plug into a single device. So that's kind of the ethos there.
Okay, and here I was just thinking it's a very, very solid and firm connection. So, but
No, and to be a little bit even more transparent, I started using Bliss adapters, and then I was making Reflex with Sonic VR, the firmware developer. And there are some controllers that use 5-volt logic, um, and there are some controllers that use 3.3-volt logic. What does that mean? It means a one or a zero is at a 5-volt level, or is that a 3.3-volt level? And I noticed that some of the connectors I was using had, let's say, PlayStation is a 3.3-volt logic uh, protocol, and it had it going to a 5-volt pin. So on Snack, we actually have, with the HDMI adapters, we have 7 pins for 5-volt and 7 pins for 3 volts, which is why on the Snacks, if people already have that, they can just get an N64 HDMI adapter, plug it in, and it's already supported. No new product needed. Just buy a new adapter for like $10, and they're off to the races without replacing the box that actually has the electronics in it.
okay. So what while we're talking about snacks, I haven't actually. I know you've sent me one with the package that you sent me as a little gift. I haven't got around to looking at snacks yet. But one thing I have looked at is the reflex adapter, and I mean I remember in our discussion where I wasn't really interested, and you were like it works with the jog con and the wheel, and I was like okay I'm sold. Let me try it. Um, Personally, I thought it was amazing. Like I was one of these guys that was like, I'm all right with my 8-bit though RF controllers. I don't really feel the latency too much on those. I feel it on Bluetooth. And when I actually use your reflex adapter, okay, the things I was impressed about was obviously not things that I've tried, but I know. So compared to snacks with the reflex, I can control the menu. I can not that I want to, but I can use a SNES controller, for example, on the Mega Drive core. But the thing that I really liked about it was just how easy it was to put the script on the Mister and then just change to so you can have like with the reflex adapters, in case you don't have one or you don't know, you can choose different configurations. So I've the configuration I've got, it does so you can't have it supporting every single console or computer at the same time, but you can have a choice of a few. So I had on my one I've got NES, SNES, Mega Drive, and like Master System. And as well as that, I've got PlayStation. But I was completely blown away at that solution. So what kind of inspired you to move away from snacks and onto reflex? Obviously, given the fact that, sorry, I'm going to add more to this question. It's a long one. So, given the fact that it works on the Mister, I also tried it on the PC and I played some N64 on RetroArch using it, and it worked amazingly well. And another
Yeah.
was there was one other thing I was going to say. Oh, actually, I'll come back to that. That's just left my head. So please take the floor.
Okay, so yeah, Snack was actually originally developed by Blue One and Risha or Katrinks or however you say her name. And the idea of Snacks is simple. It is, let's use extra I/O pins directly from the FPGA and connect the controller port to it. And that's it. So what's interesting, it doesn't go through any of the ARM CPU. It doesn't have a USB delay. It doesn't have to pull. Let's connect the controller to the FPGA just like you're plugging it into the front of your Super Nintendo. The just the one technical side note, the reason Snack has any kind of circuitry at all is because the FPGA, those pins are only rated for 3.3 volts. And a lot of these controllers, like your Mega Drive controllers, they have 5-volt logic. Super Nintendo, same thing. So you have to level shift the logic from 5 volts down to 3.3 volts. That's what Snack is. It's simply level shifting. It's decreasing the voltage of the controller to work directly with the FPGA, just like the console would. So the real advantage for Snack now compared to when it came out are peripherals like light guns, memory cards, things like that. Absolutely zero latency, like microseconds of latency for the level shifter. So that's kind of Snacks. And after Snack came out, the original Snack implementation for cores, they had a fast polling script to enable 1 kilohertz USB polling on MiSTer, which overclocks and allows for lower latency over USB. And kind of around that time, then you started seeing, well, we started measuring controllers as a community, and you see a lot of controllers that are 3 to 4 milliseconds, some under one. very few of them under one, but USB can be really good. And so at around that time, there was a product called Damon Byte that came out that's super cool. It uses an Arduino microcontroller, and it basically programs the logic to convert your regular controller to USB. And I was working with Mick for a little while trying to figure out if we could make a universal MacGyver, the developer of Damon Byte, to make a universal style Damon Byte that you could have multiple firmware modes in, and also use some kind of controller adapter like the HDMI connectors. So you could have one device with multiple controller support. And so that was kind of the reason that I stumbled across Sonic VR, who is making this RetroZord open source firmware using the same microcontroller. Started working with him over the course of a year and a half, and made Reflex Adapt. And like you said, it's kind of pros and cons. And yeah, they're kind of competing products, but Stack it's better, but only for MiSTer. It can't control the menu, but you can use things like light guns. Reflex works with MiSTer, PC, the new firmware we're releasing also works with Switch, has X input mode, works with PS3. And so that's kind of like, there's a Venn diagram and there's a lot of overlap, but the result is both of them give you like 1 millisecond or less range latency for your classic controllers. And so I think they complement each other really well. And I'm about to release Snack 64, which has 4-player ports for the N64, as well as backwards compatibility. And I'm also restocking Reflex Adapt this week.
Oh, nice. Very good to hear. So, to get it straight, so you can, all right, so I can actually play with my SNES controller on my Switch coming up when that's released. So that's actually fairly awesome. So that means all the SNES online games, if you're using that, I mean, you're probably going to be playing it on a MiSTer if you've got a Reflex, but that's good to see the option there. What I do want to ask is, do you think something like the Reflex, you'll ever add compatibility for the Analog Pocket, for example? Is that something that could happen in the future?
Yeah, so I haven't tested this myself, but because we're supporting X input with this new firmware, which is likely what we'll ship with the new adapters, there's one last bug we want to work out. X input is what my understanding the Analog Pocket needs, and so that makes it compatible with Analog Pocket. And I believe testers have already verified that on my Discord server.
Okay, so that's excellent. So that may open like a whole new market for it. I know your reflex adapters are very popular and they sell out very, very quickly, but this might be a good way for people with the analog pocket. So I've got like there's people on my channel that have a MiSTer and an analog pocket, and there's people that have just one or the other. So the people that have both, they game in front of the TV on the MiSTer. Analog pocket is generally a handheld, but then you've got people that the only FPGA device they've got is an analog pocket. And I always recommend to them, if that's your only device, get the dock, because you're going to play that stuff on your TV with people when they come around. So hopefully in future they can actually add original controllers to cores. That's actually very, very good. Something something I look forward to. I look forward to covering that on the channel when it comes out.
Yeah, the Pocket's I'm not the biggest handheld gamer, so maybe it wasn't ever going to be for me, but the Pocket is a very sleek and very good price solution in my opinion. I mean, some pros and cons versus MiSTer. The cords are different, but it supports cartridges. That whole thing everyone already knows about. It's a great value proposition for the Pocket, and yeah, the idea of Reflex, my Reflex product line, is peripherals, and so that extends obviously outside of MiSTer. But I'm never going to leave MiSTer in the dust. So USB control support now. 1 millisecond means 1,000th of a second, which means over a 90% probability that if you press a button at any given time, it's going to count in that frame. So it's good enough pretty much for any kind of speed running, competitive gaming, etc. It's gotten to the point where we're just kind of spoiled for choice.
Yeah, I'm hardcore. I can feel 1 millisecond of lag, man. No, I'm only joking. I'm good with that. For me, that's negligible. It's not anything that I think it won't be a factor in me thinking, yeah, I'm not going to use this. Obviously, Snack has 0, that has 1. But honestly, if you're a human out there and you're like a cyborg or something and you can feel 1 millisecond of lag, then definitely contact me. We could probably do a good video on you. Um,
It's definitely measurable. It's definitely also imperceivable. I remember in college there was this thing outside of one of my engineering classes that was a senior project, and it was a little board, and it had a prompt on it that said, when the LED lights up, press the button. And so there'd be a random time delay, like maybe 5 or 10 seconds, and then an LED would light up and you'd press the button. The fastest you can do it, even anticipating with instruction, your fingers on the button, all you have to do is, brain sends a signal to your muscle to push the button, was like 100 milliseconds. And usually it was more like 200 milliseconds. So our reaction time is really the bottleneck, but it's nice to basically zero out if displays could be zero latency, if controls can be zero latency, that's all better for everyone. Even if you can't feel it, it's still better. But obviously, we're the weak point as humans.
Okay, and just for a bit of context on that, 100 milliseconds is roughly around six frames of animation. So that's your kind of reaction
That's right.
time. So I know in Street
That's
Fighter,
right.
like I can do some one frame combos, but I'm timing those. I'm not seeing and kind of reacting to it. It's when the combo link starts, I've got one frame to press an additional button after the first button. So it's different to doing combos. It's actually your reaction time. So. Yeah, awesome,
Yeah,
awesome.
that's just raw reaction time compared to something you're anticipating and timing
Of
and putting in
course.
motion ahead of time. So yeah,
Okay. Right. Okay. So a few general questions we'll go with to lighten it up a bit. So, what's your favorite Mr. Core?
that's an impossible question. I mean, when I started, I'm trying to remember the timeline, but I think Genesis Core had not yet come out. It was just NES Core, and SNES Core is being teased. And at the time, I was following this guy on YouTube, JW Donnell, I think was his name, who was developing his standalone SNES FPGA core. And I used to watch those videos and just dream, like, oh my gosh, SNES, FPGA core, HDMI, like that was the dream. So it's so funny to look back and see all the things we have now. I have to say, CPS, I can't just pick one, so I'm going to give you my top list.
Okay.
CPS 2, Neo Geo, gonna be cheesy, but Super Nintendo, Genesis, NES, and then I really like Irem M92 that Wicker Walker developed. I really like, and then of course PlayStation and 64. I mean that, and obviously Saturn when it finishes. So that's like 10 cores. I just can't pick one because depending on the mood or whatever, um, they just all have so many good games I enjoy.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair. It's like I always get asked what's my favorite console, and if I had to pick one based on the nostalgia, it would have to be the Super Nintendo or the PC Engine. But it's very difficult to answer because sometimes I'll say Super Nintendo, sometimes I'll say PC Engine. I like the other consoles as well, but those two are very special for me. So, some of these questions are definitely impossible to answer, and your answer's fair, dude. It's fair. Okay,
I'm gonna
go,
add one more then.
yeah, go
PC
on.
Engine, yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah, man,
PC
love
Engine is awesome.
Love the PC Engine. Like I was the only one I knew. There was one friend of a friend's that had it, but we never got around to swapping games. I like the Japanese import of it, man. I absolutely love that machine, man. It was brilliant. Even to this day, like I play stuff like Bloody Wolf, Sun 2. I know as PC Kid in Turbo Graphics it was bonk. Then there's a really good Batman game where you're in a maze. There's a whole bunch of really good arcade games like Ninja Spirit. So the IRM, you said M92, the M72 games like Legend of Hero Tomna, Ninja Spirit, R-Type. There's a whole bunch of good games on there, man. And the games were very, very good arcade ports. If they weren't arcade perfect, but the playability was definitely there.
Yep, and the cave core, which has kind of been not abandoned, but it's most of the way done, but not actively developed on recently. But the cave core is so good, and as kind of these are all machines. Again, I only had a Nintendo and a Super Nintendo and a PlayStation growing up, with very few games. So these are all I kiosk like I played Sega stuff at my friend's house or at the kiosk at Toys R Us. So like having any of these things this accessible is great, and then having kind of more hard to justify things like the 32X and Sega CDE and the PC Engine CD. Like those things are just nice because that hardware is not the most fun to keep working, to recap, to have out. And so I think there are so many important cores that maybe aren't the ones I play the most, but it's so nice to have preserved in some open source way that in the future can be continued to improve and implemented in new ways.
Cool. Okay, so the next question now, again, I don't expect you to have one answer for this. I'll change it slightly. I was going to say, who's your favorite developer or who are your favorite developers? But to be honest, I think you've kind of answered that with the cause. So maybe we should skip that one. I'm just going looking over my notes here. So I think is it fair to say that the cause that you've mentioned, and you've mentioned a dozen, the guys that are behind those cores would be your favorite developers?
Yeah, that's true. And also, I really like the Rising core. I think that one's great, and some of the Toplin stuff. Like, I think there are tons of good developers. There's no shortage of that. If we could just clone them, that would be great. I mean, you have Hotego, you have Wickerwaka, you have some of the people on the Mars team that have done great work in the past, and then you also have Robert Pipe, who's done some of the most important console cores, as well as SRG 320, who's done Genesis, Super Nintendo, and now Saturn. You can't really pick one. And then Storage, who kind of orchestrates everything and keeps everything together and cohesive. Can't pick one. There are so many good developers.
Yeah, oh, that's a fair answer. It's another question that's very, very difficult to answer. So one thing I meant to touch on earlier as well. So, you do latency tests for controllers, and that definitely seems like something that a lot of work is involved in that. So, what kind of brought that on, as well as doing your store, taking on the additional work of pretty much testing what the input lag is for every controller? Like, what kind of inspired you to do that?
I think it's easy to feel like when you run a store that's associated with an open source project that like you should be giving back in some way aside from just making hardware available. Like that's a nice service, and Mr. definitely relies on hardware vendors around the world to provide the hardware needed. But I really like controllers are something I'm passionate about, and I love the feel of controllers, the D-pad and the nuances and the discussions and people's insights and whatever. And at the time, there was so much. This is around the time that Snack was coming out, and people were saying, "Well, you don't really need Snack as USB is fast enough because I can't feel it." Kind of the conversation we already had.
Hmm.
Can you perceive the lag? Whatever. And so, a couple people on the Discord came up with a test core, and I'll just explain the basic operation of it. You have a little Arduino hooked up to a computer, and the Arduino is randomly basically pulling a pin low to ground that's soldered to a controller button, which sends a USB input to the MiSTer, and the core then outputs a signal when it gets the input back to the microcontroller. So it's this loop of microcontroller commands a button press, MiSTer receives it, sends that signal back to the microcontroller, and the microcontroller measures the difference in time between the moment it pressed the button and the moment it got the signal back. And this is done over the user port, so there's no delay from MiSTer to the Arduino. And so there's a script on the computer, or the script on the computer. Well, yeah, you connect to it via computer, and it reads out. It does this until you unplug it, basically. So what I'm doing is I'm capturing 2,000 um, iterations of this, and then dropping it into a program that then computes all the statistics on that controller and what it's like average, min, max, standard deviation, and all that stuff. And then I'm also able to now generate plots that kind of show a histogram distribution of all the results, which I think is kind of fun. It's fun to be able to visualize this controller versus that controller.
Okay, right, and right, okay, so kind of rounding it up now over here. What advice would you give to someone that wants to turn their passion into a business? Like, what is the one single piece, the most important thing you can tell them? Like a bit of encouragement.
Yeah, I would say, oh, one piece. That's hard because obviously running a business, there are a few things. It's the product you make and it's the service you provide on top of that product. So it's having, I would say your website is critically important. Where it's hosted, is it accessible? Is Google indexing it? Are the product descriptions clear? Is payment easy? And do you fulfill orders on time? Is maybe the most important thing. We strive to fulfill orders in less than 72 hours. Typically, it's within 24, but life happens. I think customer service ends up being the part where it actually helps you grow your business as well as marketing. But first, you have to be able to make the thing that you want to sell. And that can be really hard. Like, hard to know, where is there a gap? what do my skills lend themselves to, or what do I want to learn? Because all three of those things kind of have to play together.
Okay. Excellent. Right. That's kind of like the end. Is there anything you want to add? Anything you want to talk about? If you've got anything upcoming you'd like to plug, any future products, anything you want to reveal, yeah, something before we end this video.
Yeah, I'd say like I just started doing a newsletter for the first time. I don't know why it took me so long. Email newsletter, which was a huge success in December. So if people are wondering why am I going dark or where am I, and they're not on Twitter, which I understand is controversial, they're not on Discord, cool too. I mean, I don't expect people to keep up with me everywhere. Um, just sign up for an email newsletter at the bottom of MiSTerAddOns.com. And every month I'll be sending what I'm working on, previews, what's new in stock. That's kind of the best way to keep up with my shop. And then of course, Mister for news sources, they're obviously listening to one now. There are plenty of ways to figure out where cores are and what's next on the project. So I think between those two things, that covers it pretty well.
Cool. All right. Well, Porkchop, thank you very much for coming on. It was an absolute pleasure. And yeah, guys, if you're not subscribed to the channel, then hey, your subscription and a like is super appreciated. Definitely check out Mr. Add-ons, well, for your Mr. needs. And this has got goodbye from Pixel Cherry Ninja and goodbye from
Porkchop Express, thank you so much.
cool.